Adam Schiff stepped into the spotlight like a man who'd spent his whole life believing credentials are a force field. He had the Stanford and Harvard Polish, the practiced TV cadence, the calm facial expression that says, "I'm the grown-up here." Dan Bongino walked in like a guy who couldn't care less about the club's dress code, only the receipt in his hand. And the minute Schiff tried to frame him as a reckless voice who didn't deserve airtime, the room snapped into the kind of tension you feel in your chest. Because once you build a public case that someone should be pushed out of the conversation, you'd better be ready for the counter case when they show up in person. For months, Schiff had been floating Bongino's name as a shorthand for what he called the disinformation problem. Not in some accidental aside either, more like a recurring example, the way politicians use a villain in a speech to give their argument a face. He'd mention podcasters and dangerous misinformation, then slide right into people like Dan Bongino, as if the audience already agreed on the label. And he did it on the most influential stages he had access to: CNN panels, MSNBC interviews, the polite world of anchor desks, and teleprompter language. The subtext wasn't subtle. Schiff wasn't just disputing Bongino's takes. He was questioning his legitimacy to have a platform at all. Bongino's response, at least publicly, wasn't the kind of response that plays well in elite green rooms. He didn't produce a carefully worded statement about dialogue and mutual respect, because that's not his brand and never has been. Instead, he did what he always does. He pulled clips, pulled transcripts, pulled dates, and built a running case that Schiff was using misinformation as a weapon. On his show, he'd line up Schiff's past claims next to later developments and ask the blunt question, if that's the record, who's really the safe narrator here? It wasn't a courtroom standard of proof, but it was the kind of argument that lands with people who feel like politics is a closed loop of insiders grading insiders. What made the whole thing combustible wasn't merely ideology. It was the personal escalation, the way Schiff didn't stop at, "I disagree," but veered toward, "You shouldn't be heard." That's a line in American culture that triggers an allergic reaction, especially in audiences already convinced the system wants them quiet. Bongino, for his part, treated that line like a declaration of war, not policy disagreement. And once both sides were locked into that framing, censorship versus accountability, it was only a matter of time before someone marketed the confrontation as an accountability debate. The pitch was irresistible to the modern political attention economy. Face-to-face, live audience, neutral venue, minimal moderation. No friendly host to soften follow-ups, no commercial break to cool down, no panel of pundits to absorb the heat. Just Schiff and Bongino, each carrying his own public record like luggage you can't pretend isn't yours. Schiff agreed, and in retrospect, you can see the psychology. He assumed the room would reward decorum and punish intensity. He believed credentials would do what they've always done in Washington: signal authority before a single word is spoken. That assumption is one of the most common mistakes in American politics right now. It's not that education or experience doesn't matter, it's that the public no longer treats them as automatic proof of good faith. A Harvard Law resume reads to some voters as trained and to others as trained to evade. Schiff has spent years perfecting the latter interpretation's worst fear: the smooth explanation that sounds reasonable while dodging the actual point. If your opponent's whole strategy is to force you out of the comfort zone of nuance and into the uncomfortable world of say it plainly, polish can turn into a liability fast. Bongino came in with the opposite energy, and the contrast was the story before the story. He didn't posture like a senator or float above the room like a professor. He moved like someone who thinks the only moral obligation in a confrontation is to be direct. And he carried papers, actual printed pages, tabs, highlights, The visual language of "I'm not just talking, I'm citing." That matters more than people admit, because audiences don't just listen to arguments. They watch for whether an argument looks prepared or improvised. The venue itself felt like a split-screen America, which is probably why the whole scene plays so vividly in people's imaginations. About 800 seats, roughly divided between Schiff fans who expected a measured takedown and Bongino fans who wanted a public grilling. The atmosphere wasn't town hall, it was closer to a boxing weigh-in, minus the gloves and the ritual politeness. People weren't there for a seminar on media ethics, no matter what the flyer said. They were there to watch two reputations collide. Schiff walked out first and looked exactly like the man his supporters wanted him to be. Expensive suit, precise hair, the slight smile of someone who thinks the other side is about to embarrass itself. He waved like a professional, took his place, and arranged his notes with the careful choreography of a longtime performer. Bongino arrived shortly after, not sloppy, not disrespectful, just visibly uninterested in theater. He nodded once, set his materials down, and started flipping pages like time was already running out. A moderator tried to introduce rules, but the rules felt decorative the moment the first exchange began. Schiff started with a familiar framing: disinformation, public harm, irresponsible amplification, the kind of language you hear in hearings and op-eds. He was building the case that Bongino represented a pattern, not an individual, and that the pattern demanded a response from platforms and institutions. Then Bongino cut in, fast, loud, not screaming, but not asking permission either, and the room changed temperature. He basically said, in plain English, you don't get to lecture anyone about conspiracy theories when you've been selling your own for years. And right there you could see Schiff's first real problem. If he treated Bongino as unserious and tried to glide past the interruption, he'd look weak. If he snapped back, he'd abandon the calm, adult-in-the-room persona he'd cultivated for TV. So he tried the middle path. Let's keep this civil. The classic politician move that sounds noble and also sounds like a plea. Bongino responded with the kind of line that plays well in a packed room. You tried to get me pushed out of the conversation, so don't ask me to play nice now. From there, the exchange turned into something closer to a public audit than a debate. Bongino didn't want to argue about whether disinformation is bad. Everyone agrees disinformation is bad in the abstract. He wanted to argue about who gets to wear the label truth teller and who has the record to back it up. So he went straight to the Russia investigation era and to Schiff's repeated media comments about evidence. He framed it as a simple question. When Schiff said he'd seen evidence of collusion, what exactly did he mean? And why did the public never see it in the way they were led to expect? This is where you have to be careful if you're trying to describe the moment responsibly, because the subject is real people and real history, not a fairy tale. The Mueller report, in its own language, did not establish a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, and that's public record. At the same time, the report documented extensive contacts and laid out episodes that became the focus of years of political debate, and that's also public record. Schiff's critics say he blurred those distinctions on television in a way that made audiences believe he held smoking gun proof he could not produce. Schiff's defenders say he was speaking about counterintelligence concerns and the totality of contacts, not just courtroom-style beyond reasonable doubt conspiracy evidence. In the room, Bongino didn't grant that nuance. He played clips of Schiff on various networks using language like more than circumstantial evidence, and he treated it like a promise that never got paid. He held up the report like a receipt and read the sentence that became the headline. Schiff tried to widen the frame: Russia's interference, the seriousness, the need to investigate. because that's the only way his past comments can be defended without conceding too much. Bongino kept narrowing it back to the rhetorical point that wins on camera. You said you had it. Where is it? If you've watched enough political confrontations, you know how this works. It's not always about who is factually right in the broadest sense. It's about who is controlling the audience's definition of the question. Schiff wanted the question to be, was it reasonable to investigate and to warn the public? Bongino wanted the question to be, did you oversell your certainty and your evidence? Once the frame is set, every answer that doesn't fit the frame looks like a dodge. Schiff's instinct, like a lot of experienced politicians, was to answer the broader question and hope the narrower one dissolves. But audiences don't forget the narrow question once it's been repeated 3 times. And Bongino, whether you like him or not, understands repetition better than most members of Congress. He treated Schiff's careful language as an evasion and kept coming back to the same point like a metronome. The crowd didn't need to adjudicate the finer legal distinctions, they just needed to feel whether Schiff was being straight with them. Then, the conversation shifted to leaks and classified information, which is even trickier territory. Bongino framed it from his background. He talks like someone who thinks secrecy rules are either sacred or useless, with no middle ground. He argued that people with access to sensitive information shouldn't selectively drip details to favored media when it helps their narrative. Schiff pushed back with the idea that oversight committees operate in a complicated environment where the public deserves transparency about wrongdoing and abuse. Bongino countered, essentially, that transparency often becomes an excuse for selective disclosure, and selective disclosure can be used to shape public perception without full context. At this point, the exchange became less about a single incident and more about a pattern of incentives in Washington. If you're in Congress and your biggest weapon is narrative, leaks are powerful because they move faster than hearings. If you're a cable news producer and your biggest weapon is breaking news, leaks are irresistible because they're prepackaged drama. If you're a politician who lives on television, a leak isn't just information. It's a storyline that makes you look prophetic. And that's where Bongino's attack landed emotionally. He suggested Schiff benefited from the story being kept alive, whether or not the underlying claims aged well. Schiff tried to refuse the premise without getting trapped in absolutes. He leaned on the importance of protecting sources and methods, the need to guard legitimate classified information, and the seriousness of Russia's actions. Bongino leaned on the moral language of oath and duty, implying that selective leaking is incompatible with that duty. To be clear, implying is doing a lot of work there, because it's hard to prove who leaked what in a given news cycle without direct evidence. But in a confrontational format like this, insinuation often functions like a verdict, because the audience is evaluating vibe and credibility more than evidentiary standards. Next came the Hunter Biden laptop episode, and this is where the story gets especially sensitive, because it touches on real reporting controversies and real claims that were hotly disputed in 2010s. Bongino framed Schiff's public comments about Russian disinformation as an example of elites using intelligence-flavored language to steer public perception. Schiff, like many Democrats at the time, warned about the possibility of foreign interference and suggested the story had indicators that warranted skepticism. Later, major news organizations authenticated portions of the materials, and debates continued about what was verified, what was context, and what was not. Bongino treated the entire episode as proof that Schiff was willing to label inconvenient information as foreign propaganda, and Schiff treated Bongino's framing as ignoring the genuine problem of influence operations. What made the exchange feel explosive wasn't the laptop itself, it was the meta question: who gets to define misinformation in real time. When politicians and former officials issue public statements, media platforms and audiences often treat them as a stamp of legitimacy. When those statements later look overstated or incomplete, the credibility damage doesn't stay contained. It spreads to institutions, experts, and journalism. Bongino argued, in effect, that Schiff was part of a class of people who always get the benefit of the doubt, even when they're wrong. Schiff argued, in effect, that caution about foreign interference is not the same thing as a deliberate lie, and that good-faith skepticism should not be retroactively criminalized by pundits. From there, the exchange moved to impeachment-era theatrics, specifically Schiff's reading of a paraphrase, or in essence, version of Trump's call with Ukraine's president. Schiff's defenders have long said it was clearly presented as a dramatized summary, not a verbatim transcript, meant to capture the thrust of the allegations. Schiff's critics have long said it blurred the line between commentary and evidence in an official setting and created confusion about what was actually said. Bongino used it as a symbol, not just that Schiff was partisan, but that he was comfortable with performance when the stakes were historically high. Schiff tried to explain the context, and Bongino tried to make context sound like an excuse for embellishment. Then came the FISA segment, which is one of those topics that can turn into a mess fast unless you keep it grounded. The Inspector General report on the Carter-Page FISA applications found serious problems and errors, and a former FBI lawyer, Kevin Kleinsmith, pleaded guilty to altering an email related to that process. Those are real, documented facts, and they matter because they give both sides something concrete to point at. Bongino framed it as proof that institutions abused their power and that Schiff minimized it when it didn't help his narrative. Schiff tried to position himself as someone who believes in reform and accountability without agreeing with every partisan interpretation of the abuse. This is where the debate format itself becomes the third character in the story. Complex topics like FISA and oversight require nuance, and nuance is the first casualty in a live confrontation built for viral clips. Bongino's advantage is that he thrives on compressing complexity into a moral story with villains and victims. Schiff's advantage is that he can speak in caveats and frameworks that sound responsible. But caveats can sound like hedges when someone keeps demanding simple admissions. So you end up with a familiar American spectacle. One man arguing like a prosecutor and the other arguing like a committee chairman, and the audience choosing whichever style matches its frustration. Bongino repeatedly returned to the deplatforming theme, and you can see why. It's the emotional engine of the whole scenario. If Schiff is framed as a politician trying to shrink the permitted range of debate, then every one of Schiff's past controversies becomes evidence of hypocrisy. If Schiff is framed as a public official trying to limit harmful falsehoods, then Bongino becomes a symbol of reckless amplification. Those are both narratives, and narratives are more powerful than footnotes. But the danger, if you care about a functional public sphere, is that narratives encourage people to judge motives instead of arguments. Schiff's attempt to correct the frame was to insist he wasn't targeting a person so much as describing a problem. He tried to say he was concerned about the ecosystem, not about silencing a particular viewpoint. Bongino didn't accept the distinction because the distinction is too abstract for a confrontational room, and because Bongino's audience doesn't trust abstractions. He treated Schiff's language as the classic move of power. Claim you're not attacking anyone personally while signaling that certain voices should be reduced. Schiff's supporters, of course, heard it differently. They heard a public servant warning about the civic costs of viral falsehoods. As the exchange continued, the crowd's reaction mattered as much as the words. You could feel the split in what each side interpreted as confidence. When Schiff stayed calm, His fans saw composure and seriousness. Bongino's fans saw smugness and evasion. When Bongino got more intense, his fans saw authenticity and urgency. Schiff's fans saw aggression and performance. That's the modern political mirror maze, where the same behavior earns opposite grades depending on which tribe is watching. The climax, in a scenario like this, isn't necessarily a single gotcha. It's the cumulative effect of stacking claims, clips, and contradictions until the target looks like he's drowning in his own archive. Bongino's strongest moments were the ones where Schiff couldn't simply say, "That never happened," because the video would roll. Schiff's strongest moments were the ones where he could say, "You're collapsing complicated events into certainty," because it's a fair critique of how punditry works. But again, fairness isn't always what an audience rewards. Audiences reward the feeling that someone is finally being forced to answer like a normal person. In the fictionalized accountability debate framing, Bongino ends up positioned as the guy who refuses to accept the usual Washington escape hatches. He doesn't care about the rhetorical diplomacy that lets politicians glide from point to point without conceding anything. He wants yes or no moments, admissions with subject-verb-object clarity, because those are the moments that feel like consequences. Schiff, meanwhile, ends up positioned as the guy who thinks the public is owed complexity, and that simplistic framing is its own form of distortion. Neither stance is inherently evil, but the collision is guaranteed, and it produces exactly the kind of tension that turns into viral content. After the event, the story almost writes itself in the way modern politics always does. Clips circulate, not the whole exchange, because nobody shares full context anymore. They share the 10 seconds that best confirms their worldview. Supporters of Bongino circulate the moments where Schiff looks cornered by his own past language. Supporters of Schiff circulate the moments where Bongino seems to bulldoze nuance and turn debate into a pressure campaign. And everyone, regardless of side, says the same thing. This proves what I've been saying all along. If you're trying to narrate this kind of confrontation in a way that feels sharp, without turning into a reckless accusation factory, the smartest move is to keep returning to questions. What standard should public officials use when they say they have evidence in national security contexts? When does legitimate skepticism about foreign interference become an overconfident narrative that damages trust if it turns out incomplete? What's the ethical line between explaining something in essence and creating a version of events that audiences might mistake for literal fact? And if a politician advocates more aggressive moderation or de-amplification of certain voices, what safeguards ensure that power isn't simply limiting opponents under the banner of civic health? Because that's the underlying fight here, beneath all the personalities. It's not just Adam Schiff versus Dan Bongino, it's institutional authority versus outsider accountability. It's the old assumption that credentials earn trust colliding with the newer suspicion that credentials teach you how to avoid consequences. It's the public's hunger for simple moral clarity colliding with the reality that many controversies are complicated and messy, with genuine bad faith and genuine good faith mixed together. And it's the uncomfortable truth that Americans increasingly treat politics like an entertainment product, which means the loudest moments often drown out the most accurate ones. In that light, Schiff's miscalculation isn't merely that he underestimated Bongino's preparation, it's that he underestimated the audience's appetite for confrontation as a substitute for accountability. Schiff likely believed that if he sounded measured, the room would reward him and punish the other guy's intensity. But intensity plus receipts is a dangerous combination, because it gives the audience the sensation of certainty. And once an audience tastes certainty, especially in a world full of spin, it becomes very hard to sell them on nuance. even when nuance is warranted. Bongino's biggest advantage in this imagined showdown is that he speaks a language that feels like the opposite of politics. He doesn't sound like a committee hearing. He sounds like a guy at a bar demanding you stop dodging. That style can be unfair, it can be reductive, and it can sometimes steamroll important details. But it also hits a nerve because so many Americans believe they've watched powerful people dodge for decades with no penalty. So when someone shows up and refuses to accept the dodge, whether you agree with him or not, the moment can feel like catharsis. Schiff's biggest disadvantage is that he represents, fairly or not, the professional class that many voters believe never pays a price. If he says context, critics hear cover. If he says complex, critics hear convenient. If he says we must protect democracy, critics hear we must protect our control of the narrative. That may not be what he means, and his supporters will argue it's a cynical caricature. But politics is not a seminar. It's perception. And when perception hardens, explanations stop working the way they used to. By the end of a confrontation like this, the winner isn't just the person with the sharper line. It's the person who set the terms of what counted as an answer. Bongino tried to make answers mean admissions, and Schiff tried to make answers mean frameworks. Bongino tried to make the past a ledger, and Schiff tried to make the past a context. Bongino tried to make the debate about trust and hypocrisy, and Schiff tried to make it about responsibility and harm. The audience, predictably, chose the framing it already wanted, then walked out, believing it had witnessed proof. And that's the final twist worth sitting with. The event changes almost nothing for the people already decided, and it changes a lot for the people who were on the fence. For the undecided viewer, the emotional question isn't who cited more documents, it's who seemed more honest about their own side's flaws. If Schiff can't plainly acknowledge moments where his rhetoric overshot the evidence, he looks like a man protecting his brand. If Bongino can't acknowledge moments where his framing compresses complexity into certainty, he looks like a man selling a story. In the end, this isn't a fairy tale about a hero exposing a villain. It's a parable about what happens when America's trust account is overdrawn and everyone argues about who made the withdrawals. It's a reminder that words like misinformation and accountability can become weapons, depending on who's holding them. And it's a warning that once politics becomes a permanent courtroom drama, everyone starts talking like a prosecutor, and nobody starts acting like a neighbor. That may be the real takeaway, not that one man won, but that the country keeps rewarding the kind of confrontation that makes winning feel more important than being careful with the truth. Then, the real aftermath didn't happen on that stage. It happened in the hours after, when the clips began living their own life without anyone's permission. The full exchange was long and messy, but the internet doesn't run on long and messy. It runs on 10 seconds that feel like a verdict. One side clipped Schiff's calm tone and framed it as adult leadership. The other clipped his pauses and framed them as the pause before a dodge. One side clipped Bongino's interruptions and called them bullying. The other clipped the same interruptions and called them, finally, somebody won't let him escape. And the strangest part is how quickly all of this stopped being about the specific claims and started being about a single emotional question. Who do you trust to narrate reality? Because that's what viewers were really voting on, even if nobody said it out loud. People weren't fact-checking in real time like a court clerk. They were feeling for the scent of sincerity. They were asking themselves whether Schiff's polished certainty sounded earned or rehearsed, whether Bongino's intensity sounded grounded or performative. And if you think that's unfair, welcome to American politics in the streaming era, where the medium rewards whatever feels most real, not whatever is most carefully hedged. It's why the calmest person in the room can lose to the loudest person in the room if the audience suspects calm is just another kind of mask. Schiff tried to do what politicians always do after a rough exchange. He went back to friendly rooms and tried to reframe. He emphasized the seriousness of foreign interference, the need for institutional guardrails, the responsibility of major platforms, the danger of viral falsehoods. He spoke in paragraphs instead of punches, in concepts instead of clips, as if the public would return to the long form and sit still. But the public doesn't return to the long form after the short form has already branded a moment onto their memory. Once people have seen a gotcha and decided it means something, the follow-up explanation looks like someone trying to negotiate with a screenshot. Bongino, meanwhile, didn't even need to spin because the whole format already aligned with his persona. He talked afterward the way he talked on stage. The other guy is an emblem of the system. The system hates accountability, and the receipts prove it. He didn't have to persuade his own audience. He only had to keep the energy pointed in the same direction long enough for fence-sitters to get curious. And curiosity is the most powerful fuel in politics right now, because it's the one thing the other side can't shame you out of. If a viewer is curious whether a politician oversold a claim or played games with framing, they're going to watch more, not less, even if they don't like the host. This is where the whole deplatforming theme becomes more than a rhetorical flourish. Because once you accuse someone of being too dangerous to be heard, you elevate them into a test case for your own consistency. Are you calling for standards, or are you calling for silence? Are you trying to reduce genuine harm, or are you just irritated that a certain kind of criticism can't be controlled? And if you've ever sat through a Washington hearing, you know how quickly standards can become standards for my opponents and grace for my allies. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Americans have watched too many officials speak with high confidence and then quietly walk away when the story turns. They've watched too many "this is settled" statements become, "well, it was complicated," and too many "we have evidence" claims become "we meant concerns." That doesn't automatically mean every loud critic is right, and it doesn't automatically mean every official is dishonest. But it does mean trust has become conditional. And once trust becomes conditional, people start grading tone as if tone is proof. Schiff's entire style is built on the old trust system, where the right vocabulary signals seriousness, and seriousness earns benefit of the doubt. Bongino's entire style is built on the new trust system, where the benefit of the doubt is treated like a scam. In that system, seriousness isn't a vocabulary test. It's whether you'll admit what makes your side look bad. That's why the most effective question in modern politics isn't "what's your policy?" It's "what would you concede?" What would Schiff concede about the way his rhetoric landed over time? And what would Bongino concede about the way his framing compresses nuance into certainty? Because the moment either of them concedes something real, the audience suddenly knows they're not just reading from a script. And that's also why the moderation conversation is so poisonous right now, even when people raise it in good faith. Every reasonable person can agree that false claims can spread fast and cause damage, especially in a crisis. But once you empower any institution to decide what counts as false in the moment, you're begging the public to ask, who gets that power, and how do they wield it when stakes are political? Schiff talks like someone who trusts institutions to refine and correct. Bongino talks like someone who believes institutions refine and correct only after the damage is done. Neither is entirely wrong, which is why the argument never dies. It just changes costumes every election cycle. If you want to understand why the exchange resonated, don't start with Schiff or Bongino. Start with the audience's lived experience. A lot of people feel like the official story is always confident until it has to apologize, and by then the apology is buried under a new headline. They feel like they're scolded for asking questions, and then vindicated years later when those questions turn out not to be crazy. They also feel sometimes like outrage merchants monetize suspicion and keep people permanently agitated, because agitation drives clicks better than clarity. So when a confrontation puts official credibility and outsider credibility on the same stage, it isn't just entertainment, it's symbolic conflict over who gets to be believed. Schiff's dilemma is that he can't fully satisfy that audience without betraying his role. If he admits too much, he validates the idea that the whole institutional class is a narrative machine. If he admits too little, he looks like he's hiding behind lawyer language to avoid accountability. So he splits the difference, and splitting the difference is deadly in an era where people crave a clean yes or no, even when reality doesn't cooperate. The more he tries to explain, the more his critics can paint him as someone who always has a paragraph when the public asked for a sentence. Bongino's dilemma is the mirror image. If he acknowledges nuance, he risks deflating the emotional engine that made the confrontation powerful. If he refuses nuance, he risks turning legitimate criticism into a permanent posture of certainty that can't absorb new information. A system built on receipts is only as honest as its willingness to show receipts that complicate the story. And that's the point where viewers should slow down and ask themselves, am I watching someone seek truth, or am I watching someone seek a feeling? The most fascinating subplot, though, is how this kind of confrontation quietly changes behavior inside politics. After a politician gets publicly pinned to their own archive, they start speaking differently. They avoid absolute claims. They swap proof for concerns. They say, we need to look into this instead of, I've seen it. That's not necessarily cynicism. It can be self-protection. And self-protection can look a lot like humility from a distance. But it also creates a new kind of problem. If everyone starts talking in careful half-statements, the public feels like nobody ever says anything real. So you get trapped in a cycle where blunt speakers gain attention, careful speakers lose trust, and then careful speakers become even more careful. Meanwhile, the audience becomes even more addicted to confrontations that feel like consequences. That's why the Bongino method, whether you love it or hate it, has an appeal beyond his politics. People want someone to put the past on the table and refuse to let power glide away from it. They want consequences in a culture where consequences often feel optional for the connected. But if you're honest, you also have to admit the risk in turning politics into permanent prosecution. Because prosecution can become a style of thinking where the goal isn't understanding, it's conviction. And once the goal is conviction, every ambiguity becomes suspicious. Every correction becomes proof of guilt. Every complexity becomes a cover story. That mindset doesn't just punish dishonest officials, it can also punish good faith mistakes. And democracies need room for good faith mistakes, or they become brittle. So the question isn't, should people be held accountable? The question is, what kind of accountability makes the country healthier rather than just more angry? In the end, the stage confrontation matters less than what it teaches the audience to reward. If we reward the person who asks hard questions, but also rewards themselves with certainty, we'll get more certainty sellers. If we reward the person who uses institutions as shields rather than as tools, we'll get more shield makers. If we reward the person who admits limits, concedes when the record is mixed, and still argues their case, we might get a politics that feels less like a cage match and more like a civic argument. And yes, that sounds idealistic. But so does the idea that trust can be rebuilt without changing what we celebrate. So when people say, that debate ended Schiff, or that debate exposed Bongino, they are missing the bigger point. The bigger point is that Americans are starving for a referee they can trust, and nobody agrees who the referee should be. Schiff wants the referee to be institutions and procedures. Bongino wants the referee to be the archive and public confrontation. Both approaches can serve truth, and both can be used as weapons, depending on the incentives of the people using them. And until audiences start demanding not just heat, not just receipts, but intellectual honesty from both sides, we're going to keep getting the same product: conflict that feels satisfying and clarity that never quite arrives.